For a while, I worked the front desk at a retirement home. My shift was from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., basically the black of night. The retirement home was nice, 3 stories, and the people lived on their own apartments and had maids to clean up after them. There was a restaurant inside that served the residents meals. Everything was nice and new. There was even an atrium in the middle of the building that had plants, water features, and a big jacuzzi. My job was to be at the front desk in case anyone needed help. Part of my job was also to walk the floors at night, just in case one of the oldsters needed anything, and to make sure the outside doors were all shut. It took me about 20 minutes to walk each floor. I had to walk the circuit at least 3 times on each floor, but it was up to me when to do the intervals. After I finished the circuit, I would go back down to the first floor where I could watch TV or read until it was time to make another round. I didn't particularly like being the only person awake in that building in the wee hours. I would have to go into the back of the building and check some of the doors, and that made me feel uncomfortable. One night, I was sitting on the couch in the first floor lobby, and I thought I saw one of the residents walking across the atrium like he was drunk. Sometimes residents would bring liquor into the atrium, which was okay as long as it wasn't in a glass bottle. I didn't have a good vantage point of the atrium with all the dense foliage and my angle from where I was sitting. I got up and entered the atrium from the south door. I looked around just in case someone needed help, but I was the only person in there. I went back to the first floor lobby couch and started watching TV again. I couldn't concentrate on it though. I kept thinking of the atrium. Something about it was bothering me. I decided just to make one more circuit of the building. I got in the elevator and went to the top floor and started my walk. All quiet. I then used the back stairs to get down to the second floor. Also quiet. Except for one of the residents running their TV very loudly. But no one had complained, so there was no need to knock on the door. I was almost back into the elevator when I looked over the side of the atrium. I saw someone in yellow swim trunks. I wasn't alarmed. I figured one of the residents was taking a late dip in the jacuzzi. Supposedly the jacuzzi wasn't to be ran after midnight. But hey, they were adults, so I wasn't going to give them a hard case about it. It was getting near 4 a.m. and I could barely keep my eyes open. I turned on the TV and sat down at the desk to do some paperwork, anything to keep me from nodding off. While I was sitting there, I saw someone walk across the atrium from the south side to the north side, just like before. Okay, now I'm getting a little pissed. Sometimes the residents have a little fun with the staff. Also, some of these old birds and cats were getting on at their age, and there had been some crazy things happening, especially when they brought out the booze. At some point, after 4 a.m., I fell asleep at the desk. I was startled awake a few minutes later when I heard some commotion in the atrium. I jerked awake just in time to see one of the residents run across the atrium to the other side. I only saw him for a second, but he had on the yellow swim trunks. I couldn't see where he went, but I could see that the north side door was propped up with one of the rocks that decorated the atrium. Propping the door open like this was certainly odd. Okay, fun games, people, I thought. Playtime is over. I got up and went to the south side atrium door. The door was stuck. I yanked on it, but it didn't budge. So I had to scurry all the way to the other side of the atrium to enter through the prop door on the north side. As I stepped into the atrium, I could hear that the jacuzzi was on the highest setting, and it was absolutely roaring. There was about a dozen beer cans on the cool decks. I marched over the fake bridge that spanned fake rocks over the river that was on the middle of the atrium. There was someone in the jacuzzi alright, but he was face down in the water. I jumped in and grabbed his arm to turn him over and start CPR, but it was already too late. He was non-responsive. I yelled for help, but the residents couldn't hear me. Most of them were hard of hearing. I tried to haul him up the jacuzzi steps, but couldn't move him much since he was twice my weight. I ran to the lobby phone. He had jammed the south side door open with some more big rocks, so I had to run fast to get to the lobby so I could call 911. The EMT showed up quickly, but my resident had set up his suicide very well. After the autopsy, the resident starter told us that he had 5 times the amount of alcohol of those 12 beer cans in his blood. I was pissed off that he played cat and mouse with me all night and left me to clean up the mess. And on the other hand, I felt guilty that I wasn't able to intrude on what he was up to. I blamed myself a lot for a long time. Also, if you've never been with a corpse alone in the dead of night, I can attest that it is increasingly horrific. I spent time working at a mental health unit for a private care home. There are always loads of stories of eerie things going on, and I never believed them. There are a couple of times I was freaked out though. Part of the job was to patrol the corridors, checking that the residents were asleep and in their beds. An important bit of info which is relevant is that the unit that I worked on was classed as a challenging behavior unit, basically violent or aggressive residents. The unit had been built for 40 residents, but because of the nature of the clients, the most they ever had was about 14. This meant that the place was mainly empty. One night I was doing a check on my own at about 3 a.m. I had pretty much finished my rounds and was about to head back to the lounge to continue watching TV in an attempt to keep myself awake. As I was heading back, I heard a bump noise and some muttering down one of the corridors. Thinking it was a resident, I walked towards the noise. It seemed to be coming from room 40, which hadn't had a resident in it for years. I was on my own. All the other staff were in the lounge. I didn't recognize the voice, and as I got to the room, I heard a loud bang. I opened the door and went in. It was a pitch black empty room, perfectly tidy with no one else in there. I freaked out and checked every room on the way back again. Chatting with the staff a few weeks later, they asked if anything eerie had happened to me yet. Playing it down, I said no. But it turns out room 40 was supposedly haunted after a member of the staff was fatally wounded there by a resident. I never told anyone at work about the incident, but it freaked me out. On a side note, not quite night shift, but eerie nonetheless. I was called into an emergency day shift. A resident was dying, and they needed extra staff to cover the floor while staff tended to the resident in his last moments. There was a call system in the building, like a hospital, which links to the pagers that the staff have to respond to. Each room has one, and the pagers allow you to see who's calling and if it's an emergency. Anyway, the resident passed away, and it was quietly told to the staff while they sorted the funeral details with the family. I was sitting in a lounge when the pager system went off for his room. Thinking the staff needed help or supplies, I went into the room. I popped my head around the door to be told that they didn't page anyone. I checked my pager, and it was his room that was calling. I reset the system and left. This happened 3 more times after that, each time within minutes of my leaving. Eventually, on the last time, I went to take the batteries out of the call system. A few minutes later, his room went off again. I still had the batteries in my pockets. We were all freaked out a little by this, so I went back one more time. The nurse that was dealing with the resident was shocked to hear what was happening. Even when I showed her the pager, saying it was a room calling, she paused and turned to the deceased. She knelt down next to him and said, in the most soothing voice ever, "It's okay, Bob. You can rest now. We'll be here for you if you need us." The alarm never went off again while he was there. We put the batteries back in after he left and the system was fine. Never had a fault again, or never went off unexpectedly again. Many years ago, I was a technical writer for a state office. My office was half of what had been an interrogation room for the Attorney General at one time. Since then, millions had been spent in renovations for the building, which had been built in the 1880s. It may have looked shiny and new, but it had some old residents left from before the renovations. I was working late and was sitting at my desk, which was U-shaped, with the center being the only open area for my office. A coworker came in, and the two of us were sitting there, at each end of the U, making revisions on a document together. Suddenly I felt like someone was in the office with us, but there wasn't anyone. The door was to our backs, but it felt like someone was on the other end of the U curved part, where my computer was. No one could have gotten there without walking through us. As we look at the spot where it seemed like someone was standing, the cord to my desk phone lifted, and it looked like someone had dropped it off the edge of my desk. I look at my coworker and she looked at me, and then we looked back at the phone cord. It was swinging back and forth, then suddenly it stopped in the dead center, as if someone put their hands out and held it there. It totally stopped swinging. She said, "Did you see that?" and ran out of the office. I left, took a walk, and went back to work a little bit later. What else was I gonna do? About a week later, I was at work late again. This time, I'm sitting at the bottom of the U, at my computer. Off to my left, I had a stack of papers, maybe 10 or 12 pages, and my glasses were laying on top of them. There was nothing near them, no air conditioning vents, and they were out of my reach. However, as I was typing, out of the corner of my eye, I saw some movement. I turned my head just in time to see the pile of papers, with my glasses on top of them, slide about 6 inches down my desk. Other things had happened over the years, but these were the two that stood out most in my mind. This was a long time ago. Let's see, about 37 years ago, as of 2016. I worked at a full-service gas station just off the highway around the South Manchester, Connecticut, USA area, just off Highway 84, going towards Hartford. Usually it was pretty quiet at night, but one time we got robbed. The robbers pulled up to the gas pumps in a car. They asked for money in the drawer. One guy had a gun, and the other guy had the gas pump. Somehow, they ended up spraying me with gasoline, and they were flicking a big lighter. They got the money and drove off. I called the police, who in turn called an ambulance. Then I called my parents. Somehow my parents beat the ambulance to the hospital, where I had a saline flush to get the gasoline out of my eyes and nostrils. This was one of many interesting nights I had as a teenager working at gas stations, but the risk of being burned by a madman with a lighter while doused in gasoline certainly takes a cake. Being a military camp guard as part of a small detachment, I was frequently assigned to do night patrols around the camp perimeter. For one of the patrols, I was walking along with a partner, wanting to complete the round before I turned in for the night. Walking around the building, we suddenly heard footsteps coming out from the building. We paused and checked our watches. It was 2 a.m. in the morning. We decided to walk around the building, checking every exit. It was a secured building that stored millions of dollars worth of equipment. Each exit was armed with an intrusion detection lock. Each lock was armed. We heard more footsteps and decided to radio back to the guardhouse. "Is there any night ops going on?" "No, everybody in the camp had checked out." The guardhouse holds the keys of the important key presses. When these keys are all turned in, no one except for the essential staff, like camp guards and other personnel on duty, are in camp. There's footsteps in Building X. All locks are red and armed. Advice? Continue with your patrol. We'll check in with duty orderly. The DOS checked the building soon after, and there wasn't anyone around. My first job as a software engineer was working at Adam Osborne and Associates at the marina. It was 1977, and I was developing simple example programs to run on the earliest microcomputers. I had a lab area with the Radio Shack TRS-80 and an Apple II, a North Star computer, and a few others. We had a small number of employees, maybe 12. One night I was working late, 2 a.m. I was the only staff person in the office. All of a sudden there was a horrendous crash and a thud, and I heard people running in the front door. I went to hide in our little stock room, behind some boxes. Some young thieves had appropriated a concrete utility cover from the sidewalk out front and chucked it through the window pane of our front door. Then they just turned the handle and they were in. Piece of cake. They grabbed 3 IBM typewriters and ran right back out. The whole episode only took 30 seconds and they roared off in their cars. I never saw the getaway car. I dialed 911 while listening to my heart pounding and waited for the cops to arrive. And that was pretty exciting. Then came the scary part, calling Adam Osborne at home at 3 a.m. and telling him what happened. Forever after, years later, anytime I ran into Adam at a trade show or show place, he would greet me warmly and remind me of the episode. I was in the middle of a job where I had been contracted to build a new control system for a calendar mill that rolled rubber into sheets. I had installed new control panels, and during setup, the system did not work as expected. So I was under a lot of pressure to find the problems and correct them. I had been poring over the schematics, looking for design errors, when I found a possible problem. This was late on a Saturday night, and I wanted to check the panel to see what could be causing the problem. When I got to the factory, it was closed. Normally, it stays open 24 hours, but this was a holiday weekend, and they had closed the entire plant. I had a security card that opened the doors 24/7, so I just went in through the back door and used the headlight to make my way through the panel that I had installed. I took off the back panel and sat on the floor. As I was busy tracing the wiring, a light was shined in my eyes and someone yelled, "Freeze!" I look up to see 2 cops pointing their guns at me, and they were shaking with fear. It was not the cops with the guns that frightened me. It was a raw fear that I saw in the cops' faces that had me scared. They had responded to a silent alarm that I did not know existed, and they had entered the same door that I had left open into the dark, scary factory floor. They had seen my headlight bobbing around behind the strange panel and taken me as a robber or an industrial spy. We all laughed after I straightened it up with them. I actually knew one of the cops. They both said that they were scared shitless of having to creep up on me in the dark, seeing my light flashing around. I often work at night, so as to not to get in the way of production. In another incident, I was working at an unfamiliar city at night in an industrial area. It was cold, with 6 inches of snow on the ground. All the equipment in the building was shut down, except for the industrial furnace that had a noisy blower running on a timer. The timer ran down, and the furnace stopped, leaving it dead silent, except for the footsteps I could hear someone walking across the roof. At first I thought I was hearing things, but they started up again, and I followed them from below. I went to the back door, made sure it was locked, and peered out the doors towards my car 50 meters away in the parking lot. It was then I noticed footsteps in the snow going around my car and right to the door where I was at. Just then I hear rattling and the shadow of someone coming from the fire ladder. I hide from the window behind a metal grinder and saw 3 hooded men drop from the fire ladder and go back towards my car. They peered into the doors, so here I was in a strange city with 3 men trying to break into my car and the building I was in. I finally found a phone in the office and called 911. It took forever for the cops to get there, over 30 minutes. It turned out that there were 3 kids in a gang who had set up their hideout on the roof of the building that was normally empty at night. They had hidden stash of stolen goods on the roof. No big deal, but hearing footsteps on the roof of an empty building in the dark of night really got to me. As a youngster, I was working in a food store. The shop was open 24/7, so naturally, sometimes I had to take the night shift. To be honest, I preferred working at night because there aren't as many customers and I didn't have to overwork. Plus, the money was slightly better. Usually, I was working with the same guy from the team, and this was a rule. Our boss didn't want to leave the shop with just one person. The area wasn't dangerous. There was mostly single family houses and schools, and it was in a safer area. One day I came in to work the night shift. I was waiting for my friend to join me when the phone rang. It was Tom, my workmate. He said his car had broken down in the middle of nowhere, and he couldn't leave it there. I didn't want to stay in the shop alone, but I understood that Tom couldn't just leave his car too. I would usually call Julia, another workmate, but I knew it was her birthday and she was throwing a party and I didn't want to ruin her night. I called my boss and I told him I would manage on my own, and he agreed on that. The night was quiet and calm. The shop was visited by parents who forgot to buy milk for their children, young men who wanted some beer, and teenagers who wanted to buy popcorn before they started to watch a horror film. After 11, it fell silent, so I opened a book and started reading. I was entirely wrapped by the crime story I was reading when I lifted my head and saw a man standing at the street, staring at the shop. Usually I wouldn't pay it no mind, but this case was unusual. The man was wearing a white suit, a hat, and had crutches, as he didn't have a right leg. I felt awkward. He was just staring at the shop and looking at me. After some minutes I was scared and regretted that I hadn't ruined Julia's night and asked her to come and join me. After some time, the guy left, but I still felt nervous. I was alone in the shop and didn't want to call anybody and wake them up. I decided that reading a book will be an excellent way to start thinking about something else. I opened the next page and the telephone rings. I picked it up and said, "Hello, how can I help you?" Nobody replied. I heard the sound of breathing. I asked again who was calling, but after some seconds, the person hung the phone up. This was the moment I was terrified. I was sure it was the guy in the white suit. I had plenty of strange thoughts in my head, including the one that I was a protagonist of a horror movie and was gonna die in some minutes. I knew I couldn't stay in the shop alone anymore. I called my father and immediately asked him to come pick me up. I also sent my boss a message that I had to close the shop because I felt sick. My father came in around 15 minutes, as he was also scared after hearing my story. For me, it was the longest 15 minutes of my life. I locked up the shop and was fighting the irrational thoughts in my head. After my dad came, I felt relief, but I also didn't imagine going back to work at night again. The next day, I wanted to hand in my notice. I knew the shop was 24/7 and all the workers took different shifts, so I didn't want to ask for any special treatment. I went to the shop and started to explain everything to my boss, telling him that I'm leaving, when he interrupted me. He said to me that he was talking with some man 2 hours ago, the man with one leg. I think my heart stopped beating for a minute after that. My boss continued to say that the man came to the shop to say sorry for staring at the shop and calling at night. The guy assumed that he must have scared me by calling. The man also said that he had been many years abroad and came to the town after 50 years that night. He was looking at the shop because he was living there when he was a kid. As we understood, it was a normal house back then. His family had to leave the country because of political persecution. The man called the shop because he found the number in the yellow pages and wanted to ask how long the shop existed. Plus, he didn't even know I saw him. When he was calling, he didn't say anything that moment because it was very emotional for him. He started crying, and of course, he didn't want to talk in such condition. All in all, he wanted to know what happened to the house during those years. I was bewildered hearing the story and didn't know if I wanted to leave my job anymore or not. Happily, my boss told me the shop can only be open at night if there are 2 workers, otherwise it would have to be closed. In the end, I stayed at the shop for some time and promised myself not to work at night alone anymore. I haven't met the guy in the suit. He probably left town, but I hope he's okay after that. This is the scariest thing that ever happened to me while I was night shift security at a data center. I was just an 18-year-old kid, and my job was to sit in the office all night, alone. This was in the early days of the internet. There was no Facebook or YouTube to kill time. Usually, I took the time to study or practice a guitar, but sometimes I needed a break from that. I decided to photocopy my face, which led to my butt and other parts. I'm the only one in the building, so it's super easy. But then, the paper got jammed after having copied my parts. There was about 1 hour before the early people would start coming in the office. I had no idea how to open this very expensive copier, and there was no manual anywhere. I was pulling the parts off, trying to remember where they came from so I could put it back. No smartphones to just snap a picture and know how to put everything together. I had pulled off and replaced many parts that gave me no access to the jammed paper. There was only 30 minutes before the first people started coming in, and what if someone decided to come in early that day? Long story short, I managed to figure out how to remove the offending jammed copy with literally only 3 minutes before someone came in to the office. This isn't a scary story, but it scared the crap out of me.